In my last video, I laid out some broad assessments of what postmodernism was, in an attempt to lay the groundwork for talking about the new cultural period in which we find ourselves today, a period after postmodernism. I said it would be helpful to look at the views of three very influential thinkers on postmodernism before explaining how our current period came to be. So here we go. The first thinker is Jean-François Lyotard, whose highly influential 1979 work, The Postmodern Condition, suggested that postmodernism had arisen out of what he called an incredulity toward meta-narratives, or more simply put, a loss of belief in big stories. Such stories once served to orient society and provide the grounding for knowledge, but have since lost their credibility with the population. As a result, all notions of an objective, absolute truth or any claim to universality become inherently suspect. Postmodernism, then, is a culture that eschews any and all such master narratives, any grand truth or meaning that would claim to give an orienting purpose to the world. Because of this, postmodern society winds up being characterized instead by a fragmentation into countless micro-narratives, a motley array of different, localized realities, all playing incommensurable language games. Truth thus radically relativized, technocratic elites just seek what knowledge is useful for gaining wealth and power, asking only, is it saleable? David Harvey gives a slightly different reading of it all. For him, what postmoderns lost wasn't exactly a grand narrative, but a commitment to any sense of eternal and immutable elements in modern life. Modernists since Baudelaire, taking stock of the fact that their brave new world of industrialization and scientific progress marked a real break from traditional modes of existence, noted that the hallmarks of this new thing, modernity, were, quote, the transient, the fleeting, the contingent. While pre-modern lifestyles were based on enduring practices and beliefs rooted in the ancient past, modern life was just the opposite, with ever-changing technologies, ideologies, and increasingly novel goods. Because of this growing sense of change and ephemerality, modernists sought, while staying true to this modern reality of flux and contingency, nevertheless to give voice to whatever was still enduringly timeless and unchanging therein. After the First World War, the first truly modern war, left the old world on its last legs, there arose a particular new urgency for articulating such a stable truth. High or heroic modernists desperately sought to create an orienting mythology fit for the modern age. The myth, writes Harvey, either had to redeem us from the formless universe of contingency, or, more programmatically, to provide the impetus for a new project for human endeavor. Tragically, as it turned out, that new project that arose only wound up devolving into base nationalist domination and racist genocide. By the time the Second World War, which these myths had only inflamed, ended, the modern quest for some transcendent vision or mythic goal seemed horrifically discredited. In the postmodernist world that took shape afterward, a life defined by the transient, the fleeting, the contingent was simply accepted as the way things are, or must be. Resigned to this, says Harvey, the postmodernist, quote, does not try to transcend it, counteract it, or even to define the eternal and immutable elements that might lie within it. Postmodernism swims, even wallows, in the fragmentary and chaotic currents of change as if that is all there is. The hope for some eternal and unchanging truth, goal, or myth is given up on. All you can do is hurl yourself into flux, discontinuity, and transience. Finally, what Fredric Jameson argued postmodernism to be is, in part anyway, actually the loss of the entire hermeneutic model, or interpretive approach to experience. That's simply to say that in the past, people tended to look at things and seek some deeper meaning to them. A work of art had a symbolic significance beyond the specific figures it depicted. A person's actions might be seen as authentic or inauthentic to some true inner core, or perhaps only as an outward manifestation of some deeper, latent neurosis. A sign only gestured towards something signified, and appearance was often in tension with reality. With the postmodern turn, however, this is no longer the case. The whole notion of a deeper meaning or truth is abandoned. Quote, depth is replaced by surface. As a consequence, any attempt to seek for something beyond or beneath our immediate, mundane, superficial experience of life is, we are told, futile. All we have is the appearance, the sign, the show. No more. Life is simply the glimmering play of shimmering surfaces, a perspective which, it not coincidentally turns out, feeds directly into the narrative of consumer capitalism. In fact, Jameson says, what we call postmodernism is really just the cultural logic of late capitalism, in which we are presented with saleable trend after saleable trend, flashy new gadget after flashy new gadget, in an endless stream of superficial moments. Without depth, without history or goal, life is simply a series of purchases. No deeper meaning needed. Reading these three thinkers in light of one another, some fascinating similarities emerge, I think. It's certainly noteworthy, for instance, that all three define postmodernism negatively, as signaling the loss of something. For Lyotard, this was the grand narrative. For Harvey, the eternal and unchanging. For Jameson, the deeper meaning. This structural overlap of postmodernism as the resulting difference of some subtraction would seem to invite comparison, even synthesis. One wonders if these thinkers aren't a bit like the three blind men in the parable, groping about at the tail, the legs, the trunk, all the while missing the elephant that unites them all. If so, what is the elephant in the room here? I'll return to this in a future video, as it's crucial to the argument I'd like to make about our new emerging period, especially as it relates to my own work. For now, let's move on, equipped with the insights into postmodernism offered by Lyotard, Harvey, and Jameson. Now that we have a sense of what postmodernism was, we can have a better understanding of what has come and is still arising after it. Postmodernism dominated cultural and intellectual production during the 70s and 80s. In the 1990s, its energy began to dissipate. The wave had crested. Some influential writers of the time were now critiquing core postmodern strategies from within. The most notable of these, in many people's minds, was the author David Foster Wallace. Wallace, despite having been associated with the postmodern paradigm himself, increasingly came to voice concerns about the role of cynical irony in postmodern culture. Co-opted by consumer capitalists and elite institutions, Wallace argued, irony had lost its power as an effective tool of critique. An irony-saturated culture is one sapped of genuine emancipatory energy. It's enervated, feckless, and thus ultimately complacent to, even complicit in, matters cynical irony used to critique. Wallace therefore looked forward to a post-cynical, postmodern ethos that eschewed irony in favor of earnest engagement. Ironically, dispensing with irony in a fully ironized culture could only but be subversive, and the prospect of a new, non-institutionalized avant-garde, one of all things, sincerity and credulity, thus opened up as a novel and important possibility. As Wallace concluded in a crucial 1990 essay, quote, "The next real literary rebels in this country might well emerge as some weird bunch of anti-rebels. Born oglers who dare somehow to back away from ironic watching, who have the childish gall actually to endorse and instantiate single entendre principles, who treat of plain old untrendy human troubles and emotions in U.S. life with reverence and conviction, who eschew self-consciousness and hip fatigue. These anti-rebels would be outdated, of course, before they even started, dead on the page, too sincere, clearly repressed, backward, quaint, naive, anachronistic. Maybe that'll be the point. Maybe that's why they'll be the next real rebels. Real rebels, as far as I can see, risk disapproval. The old postmodern insurgents risked the gasp and squeal, shock, disgust, outrage, censorship, accusations of socialism, anarchism, nihilism. Today's risks are different. The new rebels might be artists willing to risk the yawn, the rolled eyes, the cool smile, the nudged ribs, the parody of gifted ironists, the oh how banal. To risk accusations of sentimentality, melodrama, of overcredulity, of softness, of willingness to be suckered by a world of lurkers and starers who fear gaze and ridicule above imprisonment without law. Wallace's ideas would indeed prove prophetic, as we shall see, and he stands as a fascinating bridge figure between postmodernism and the period that's come after. At the same time Wallace and others were posing their critiques, many cultural critics were increasingly coming to the conclusion that whatever had animated the postmodern moment was now a largely spent force. Less and less ink was being spilt on the topic, and more cultural products seemed less amenable to analysis using the old postmodern rubric. In 2002, concluding the second edition of her influential book, The Politics of Postmodernism, theorist Linda Hutcheon drove the nail into the coffin. Quote, "Let's just say it's over. The postmodern moment has passed, even if its discursive strategies and its ideological critique continue to live on, as do those of modernism, in our contemporary 21st century world. Literary historical categories like modernism and postmodernism are, after all, only heuristic labels that we create in our attempts to chart cultural changes and continuities. Post-postmodernism needs a new label of its own, and I conclude, therefore, with this challenge to readers to find it and name it for the 21st century. It should be clear immediately why a post-postmodern period demands a new label. Postmodern, we can admit, was already a bit silly sounding itself, even etymologically paradoxical. But while post-postmodern might be technically correct, the compound absurdity and pretense make it simply untenable. Besides that, defining something entirely in opposition to something else fails to offer something positive about the new thing in question, and it seems more appropriate that periods should be associated with their own characteristics rather than simply as a response to another's. In any event, a number of new labels have been proposed by a new generation of cultural theorists that has subsequently arisen, and who have taken up the challenge of periodizing post-postmodernism with its own label. Among them, remodernism, performatism, and metamodernism have all been proposed, and I'd like to investigate each, both for what they have to say on their own terms, but also to see what points of commonality can be found between them, to help us triangulate, you could say, an even larger sense of the period based on these diverse descriptions and analyses. Plotting these three interpretive paradigms, which have been proposed as labels for the post-postmodern moment, I hope to reveal some trends and trajectories common to all, which shed light on where we are now in 2019.